Welcome to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. My name is Jonathan Brown. I'm a professor in the Legitimacy Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, which is right next door, and together we're sponsoring this event. We're very happy to have Dr. Nayed here to talk to us about the situation in Libya today. Dr. Nayed is the ambassador of Libya to the United Arab Emirates, but today he's here in his private academic capacity as a scholar and the founder of the Libyan Institute for Advanced Studies in Tripoli, and also the Kalam Institute. The Kalam Institute, which is in Abu Dhabi. And he, I was telling you earlier, I've never gotten so many emails from people asking for speakers' contact information before. He has a huge number of friends and admirers in the Georgetown area. Part of this I discovered is because he studied and taught at the Pontifical University in Rome, Pontifical Institute in Rome, and so he has lots of friends on the Georgetown campus. And he did his PhD in Canada, and then graduate work in Rome and elsewhere, where he also taught. And he also studied and taught in Malaysia at the Islamic University, or ISTAC, at the ISTAC Center in Malaysia. And he'll be speaking today about, as I said before, the situation in Libya in his private capacity. And I should add that this is not just CCS policy, but Georgetown's new policy, which is by entering this room, you have consented to be recorded, because the program is being recorded, and instead of getting everybody who's going to ask a question and receive an answer to sign a form, anything that's discussed in here is being recorded, even if you're just asking a question, so it's all on the record. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to our distinguished speaker, and we'll have until 7 p.m., so plenty of time for his presentation and also for question and answer. Thank you very much.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very, very much for coming. I'm honored to see old friends and new friends here tonight, and grateful that you are here. I'm also grateful to the host, Professor John Esposito, who invited me on the letter, but managed to go to the UAE just as I was coming from the UAE to the United States. A dear old friend. We met in Rome many years ago. And thank you, Professor Jonathan Brown, for the introduction. May I start by asking you for a minute of silence for a 2-year-old baby who died yesterday in Benghazi with his mother and father because of an explosion that happened. And also a young man who saved the lives of many spectators as they came out of a marvelous basketball game in Benghazi. He actually found the bomb and ran with it so that it was detonated and it killed him and not the crowd. These are only some of the martyrs of Benghazi, Libyan and non-Libyan. We also remember Ambassador Chris Stevens, who died in Benghazi, and his colleagues at the American Embassy, fellow diplomats who were doing their job and helping the Libyan people. So if I may ask you for just a moment of silence for all the departed who have given their lives for the sake of freedom of our country. Thank you. I am very fond of a particular sage of Islam, a man called Ibn Ata'Allah al-Sakandari, who's a great Shadili Sheikh. And he has this beautiful phrase that says, "Man ashraqat bidayatuhu, ashraqat nihayatuhu." He whose beginnings are luminescent, his ends shall be luminescent. And I cannot remember any time in my life when I felt luminescence more than in the beginning of the Libyan revolution. It was a very dangerous time, a very difficult time, a very anguished time, but it had a kind of light and luminescence to it that is almost impossible to describe. And yet, nowadays there is a darkness in Libya that is also very difficult to bear and very difficult to describe. It's as if our sage was mistaken. Here is a case of luminescent beginnings and rather dark endings. So either the sage is wrong, and we followers of sages don't usually admit this, or the Libyan process, whether you call it an uprising or a revolution, has not ended yet. And the end will be, inshallah, luminescent. And that we're passing through a stage, perhaps a desert of search and bewilderment, maybe a dark night of the soul, as John of the Cross would call it, that will lead to some sort of an ascent and some sort of a luminescent ending. So I'd rather believe that the sage was right and that the process is not complete and that we have to go on. Now, speaking of beginnings, the great scholar Hannah Arendt actually believed that beginnings were absolutely essential to being human. As a matter of fact, she defined humanity as such with beginnings, what she called natality and the ability to give birth to new things. And indeed, the Libyan revolution, I actually like to call it an uprising rather than revolution. It's because I'm old enough to have witnessed Gaddafi's so-called revolution from its inception and got really scared of the term because of the 1978 and 79 and 80s and how the word revolution was used. So I kind of, even when we began to call the uprising a revolution, I got very, very nervous. And I'm still nervous every time the word revolution is mentioned. It has to do with the ordeals of the Libyan people in the late 70s and early 80s. So, indeed, when we look at the uprising, we find that Hannah Arendt was right. There is a kind of a being born feeling, a feeling of newness, a feeling of what she called surprise and bewilderment, and a feeling of excitement. And she believed that this was so essential for humanity, that's what was so important about human action, that it was distinctive because it had freedom and it had plurality, like the abundance of the spring, for example. So that when we say the Arab Spring, and now I know many people use it sarcastically almost and talk of an Arab winter and lament the Arab Spring, I think it was Arab Springs rather than spring, and I think that the spring is still springing, and that it's not a finished process, and that we can only appreciate it as spring if we actually see it as an open-ended process that has not been completed yet. So Arendt was speaking of startling unexpectedness, and indeed it was an unexpected uprising. Many people gave up on the Libyan people's uprising. Many people felt quite resigned to the fact that this dictatorship would continue. So much so that for the last decade of that dictatorship's life, many people made a settlement with it in some form or other and tried to reach some sort of a dialogical engagement with it. And it was almost almost impossible to imagine an uprising of the kind that has happened. But the Libyan people, being humans, as Hannah Arendt would say, took action in the most profound sense and actually revolted against all the tyranny, against all the darkness, and accomplished amazing things beyond imagination. Surely they did get help, and that help is very important and is very much appreciated. And in these days of denial, it is very important to express appreciation to all the partners who helped us, including the United States of America. But again, even the invoking of that help was creatively sought by young Libyans everywhere, including here in Washington, and some of them are present and very much appreciated. And these people were able to explain to the world that we needed help, and to do it in such a timely fashion that the help did come and save the people of Benghazi. We would have had genocide in Benghazi had we not had that intervention. So now people sometimes have regrets and say, maybe we shouldn't have helped these people, because we helped them, and the very city we tried to save basically killed our ambassador. Some people say that, and there is a certain painful truth about this. But it's also true, and this is hardly covered by the media, that the people of Benghazi basically pushed out all armed groups that they suspected of being involved in that crime out of Benghazi for almost more than a month or two. And unfortunately were failed by their government and Congress when they kind of sanctioned those forces and declared them legitimate. So there was a lot of bravery even in the aftermath. So Arendt was very interested in revolutions, and she said she was interested in revolutions because, as she says, and I quote, "Revolutions are the only political events which confront us directly and inevitably with the problem of beginning." So indeed there was a beginning of freedom, a luminescent beginning, a beginning that was quite exciting and quite amazing, quite miraculous in many ways. And yet something really strange happened. What happened to us? And how is it that we ended up with the situation that we've got today? As we speak today, apparently there was a firefight near the GNC, our Congress. There were murders yesterday in Benghazi. And it's quite dark. How did this happen? How did this amazing freedom of action that Arendt would describe as revolution in the true sense, how did it transform to what we have today? Perhaps, and this is one possibility, maybe we escaped our freedom. Maybe freedom was a bit too much for us. There is a great scholar called Eric Fromm who wrote a book which was called Escape from Freedom, in which he describes how people kind of panic when they become free and freak out and need constancy and assurance that freedom cannot give them anymore. And they resort to mechanisms for escape from freedom. He identified three important mechanisms. One which he called authoritarianism, either accepting an authority over me so that I don't have to make my decisions and I don't have to have the challenges and the responsibilities, or worse in some cases, impose my will on others so as to end the indeterminacy by imposing my will and becoming a tyrant. Another mechanism, which he called destructiveness, basically destroys everything, destroys the world. Maybe the people who blow themselves up and take a few people with them are basically escaping from freedom through destructiveness and not simply expressing certain religious ideas extremely, as is often interpreted. The third form of escape he called automaton conformity, to find an example like a template and to basically blindly follow that template. There are plenty of seats in the front if you. And I have seen many young people who look identical to each other, It's very strange, but even sometimes when people want to rebel, they look the same in rebellion, And there is some truth about this automaton conformity. Surely we see all these tendencies, but maybe it's not as simple as just escape from freedom. Maybe what's happening is also a kind of collapse of the attempts at meaning that we're going about. Maybe we're trying to find meanings or even ultimate meanings, as Viktor Frankl would say in his famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. And maybe we're just having difficulties grasping meanings or articulating meanings. And maybe we are replacing for the search for meanings for fast meanings, as in fast food, things that you just pick up from a vendor who gives you 5 books and 2 tapes or CDs, and you listen to them, and all of a sudden you have meaning. Because you know exactly how the world works. You know the categories of human beings into us versus them. So maybe there is a crisis of meaning that we're not very good at admitting and seeking a resolution of. Or maybe it's because we have simply been too facile about things and have sought what Dietrich Bonhoeffer would call cheap grace. grace without works, to put it in Catholic terms, without making the effort. We want to be saved. So maybe we haven't done our homework. Maybe we're not working hard enough. I don't know. But whatever it is, we are definitely not in a very good place in our history. Too many people are dying. Hundreds of people have died in Benghazi since the revolution. Our jails and so-called holding centers are full of people who have not been given due process, who have not been put on trial, and who are in some cases tortured. And this has been documented by not only Amnesty International, but by many rights groups in Libya itself, like Libyan Lawyers for Justice, for example. So what is the problem? If we go back to Hannah Arendt, she identified a very strange group of people, which she called professional revolutionaries. And I'm afraid some of the guilt for what's happening to us is perhaps to do with professional revolutionaries. There are people who have made the revolution a profession and self-righteously are imposing their will on others, are imposing their ideologies on others. These ideologies sometimes are Islamist, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're even tribal, sometimes they're even regional. But what they have in common is this will to power of sorts, which breeds a kind of fascism. And I know that this word is strange to use in this context, but I remember in Tripoli when the tombs of Sufi sages were being demolished, as in Sidi Sha'ab in Tripoli. I remember the so-called Supreme Security Committee was guarding the people who were demolishing the mosque and the tomb, and they were wearing black shirts. And it just clicked right there and then that what I'm basically seeing is Mussolini replayed. It's as if Libya has maybe this almost subconscious trend of fascism about it that is left over from the days of Graziani and Mussolini. And that maybe all Gaddafi was for 42 years was simply a Libyan version of Graziani. As a matter of fact, it makes a lot of sense because he apparently really liked Graziani in his books. And in some of his speeches would make phrases that are straight out of Verso il Fazzan, for example, and some of the other books of Graziani. So maybe what we have is basically a phenomenon of what R.G. Collingwood calls encapsulation in his autobiography and also in his the idea of history. Encapsulation is a process whereby you have nuggets of the past that are held almost frozen in time and then they become active again. If you go to Malta, for example, you can hear most likely North African accent from the 16th century encapsulated in the Maltese language. It's very old Arabic, So sometimes this happens. Maybe what we have basically is an encapsulation of fascistic tendencies from the 1920s and 30s that are being resurrected, sometimes wearing an Islamic garb or attire, and sometimes wearing a secular one, and sometimes wearing a tribal one, and sometimes wearing a regional one. But in all cases, fascism of one sort or the other. And if you think of this, it makes sense of a lot of things. It makes sense of the thug behavior, makes sense of the pushing around, it makes sense of the senseless violence, it makes sense of the categorization of people into us and them and the oppression of other people. So maybe what's happening in Libya is that we are descending into a kind of a fascistic underworld that just is there and was never really resolved or dealt with. Maybe even in the collective unconscious of sorts, maybe there's an archetype of will to power that's somehow at play. And this has to be faced and has to be dealt with. And what's amazing is in Libya, as I see a lot of anxiety today, a lot of worry, a lot of dread, a lot of almost depression. But at the same time, I see a lot of certitude. People are so certain that they have it right. And certain groups are so vehement and so aggressive and possessive of things, and most importantly of the joints of the state. It's as if they try to occupy the very joints of the state, and then the state can't function. It's like having arthritis or having joint pain, you know. The state can't function because the joints are, instead of being populated by people who are interested in Libya, they get populated by people who are interested in their party or in their group, on their jama'ah, or in their, and it's so sickening because they're basically paralyzing the country to the point where no prime minister has been able to really do his job, because every time they try to do their job, they find that the joints are paralyzed, be they the defense ministry or the interior ministry or the intelligence or the central bank or the finance ministry. Or so maybe what we need to do is to cure these joints by asking these guys to take it easy, you know, to let go. Don't be so possessive. We have some neighboring countries where groups were so possessive that other groups crushed them and are now equally possessive. So I don't think that this is going to get us anywhere. I hope that in Libya we can avoid this kind of crushing and counter-crushing. No need for this. And I think the problem is certitude. I know this is very strange for a Muslim theologian to say. Normally theologians ask you to be certain about God and about this and about prophecy. And I am certain in that sense of yaqeen, you know. But I think there is a mature certitude and an immature certitude. A mature certitude is based on humility that receives the certitude from above. And the false certitude is a certitude of imposition of will. And I see too much of the second type, where people are so absolutely sure of themselves, they're not willing to listen to others. It is impossible to make a democracy, to make a constitution, without listening to others, because ultimately constitutions are rooted in their legitimacy. They are rooted in consensus. And consensus cannot happen through imposition of will. Consensus necessarily means dialogue. Consensus necessarily means polyphony. And not only polyphony, but the ability to listen to multiple voices all at once and to accommodate others. Perhaps the problem lies precisely in that we have called our uprising a revolution. Because what happens when you call something a revolution is you get certain vices cropping up. The first vice is the vice of self-righteousness. A revolutionary feels that they're right and that they've revolted against the wrong. They also have a notion of victimhood, quite intense, that they were victimized and tyrannized, and therefore now they've got a kind of a right to victimize others. It's very interesting that some of the people who were tortured in Muslim, when they became guards now, are torturing their prisoners the same way they were tortured. It's as in the cases of abused children who grow up to be abusing fathers and mothers. You know, it's very sad, but it has to do with this feeling of entitlement because you were victimized. And there's also the vice of moral and epistemic arrogance, or feeling that you've got all the right values and that the other doesn't have them, and that you're entitled because of this. That you're not only entitled to money, so that you expect pay. And one of the biggest mistakes the NTC made that is perpetuated until now is what we've turned young, heroic people into cash junkies, through getting them addicted on giveaways. So that when the giveaways stop, they get basically withdrawal symptoms and they come to the Prime Minister to demand with force. There have been cases where people had to sign checks with a gun to their head. And it's very, very sad that we've done this to our youth. There's also the incredible vice of dehumanizing other human beings. Gaddafi used to call us rats, you know, dehumanizing us to the level of rodents. But now we are dehumanizing people to the level of algae. Okay, so that we've done worse than Gaddafi. At least rats are a bit, you know, smart and, you know, algae. I mean, that's really bad. You know, and it's because algae is green and worthless. And I was trying to get this translated, this tahalib, and Ed pointed out that the Japanese value algae. You know. So it's not so bad. But anyway. So we have dehumanized each other, you know. And Immanuel Kant, in his Ethics, there's this central notion of the distinction between a thing and a person. A person is not for the sake of something else, but for the sake of himself or herself. And a thing may be for the sake of something else. We've made our fellow Libyans into things, not persons. And that's why it's easy to torture them. That's why it's easy to deny their rights. All of this because we called ourselves the revolutionaries and called what we have done a revolution. It would have been much better to just call it an uprising and spare ourselves these injustices. You know, Edmund Burke, as early as 1790, in his book Reflections on the Revolution in France, pointed to this kind of behavior. And Arendt also, in her book of 1963 on revolution, points to how this happens. And it's very, very instructive to read this literature of post-World War II that analyzes fascism, totalitarianism, tyranny, and how it arises. So now, how can we get over this? I think we have to get over this by moving from revolutionary legitimacy to constitutional legitimacy. And I'm of the view there was a huge mistake made in the summer of 2011 when people were meeting in Benghazi to discuss the constitutional declaration. You know, the Libyan flag was resurrected overnight, you know, and it's the flag of the Kingdom of Libya, you know. And the Libyan anthem was resurrected overnight, and it's the anthem of the Kingdom of Libya. Yet the constitution of the Kingdom of Libya was not resurrected. I think that in the summer of 2011, I would have rather if this was a restoration movement rather than a writing a constitution from scratch movement. Because we basically committed ourselves to reinventing the wheel and to starting from zero. I am not sure that the kind of humility that our forefathers had in the 1940s and 50s is available today. Those gentlemen, and I'm afraid there were no women in the constitutional committee of that time, which I hope will change now, those men were humble enough to listen to each other, even though they were proud Bedouin tribesmen and so forth, but they actually were humble enough to listen to each other. And they were humble enough to listen to Adrian Pelt, a man coming from far away, you know, with a UN mandate, and they listened to the experts. There were some Palestinian experts and some Iraqi experts, and they listened to them. And they managed to write a constitution. I'm afraid the listening required to reach a consensus is not there in Tripoli today. I do not see many people listening to each other. Yes, there are over, at last count, I think 32 dialogue initiatives. But they are all monologues about dialogue. They're not dialogical. It's very, very strange. And as soon as people try to get together to have dialogue, you will find people trying to possess the dialogue. So it is so-and-so's initiative for dialogue. I told Tariq Mitri just a couple of days ago, I said, Tariq, if this is going to work, please don't put any Libyans in charge of Libyan dialogue. Just do a UN dialogue and get us some weird nationality like a Finn. You know? I'm sorry, Ed is married to a Finnish lady, so that's fine. Or from Denmark, or, you know, somebody neutral so that people don't have to compete for who owns the dialogue. And indeed, we do need dialogue, and we need it urgently. So there was a problem of reinventing the wheel and deciding to do constitution from scratch, which is okay if you're able to do it. The problem is, we have now a tectonic slide that's causing the earthquake that we're feeling. Okay? And that is a very simple slide. We have a time for the life of the GNC, and we have a constitutional process, and they're supposed to go in tandem. Okay? So the constitutional process is supposed to happen in this time. Because the GNC mistook itself for a parliament, okay, and they had the GNC mistook himself for a president, and the committees of the GNC mistook themselves for an executive. They, rather than go about writing the constitution or generating the committee that will write the constitution, they did everything else but going towards writing the constitution. So now the period is almost over, and the constitutional committee of 60 hasn't been elected yet. Time runs out in February. And yes, there are many GNC people who say there is no deadline. The GNC can be perpetuated in life because it has that ultimate legitimacy, and we can take our time to write the constitution. But I'm afraid the Libyan street is saying no, for the most part, as far as one can possibly measure it. There are now young people who have created something called the movement of 9th of November, who are saying, no, if you want to continue, we respect the GNC as a structure, but you need to be re-elected in order to get a new lease on legitimacy. We have to renew your legitimacy. So it's a very important movement, and it's very interesting to see what's going to happen on the 9th of November. And some people are saying, forget it, you can't write the Constitution, let's go to the Constitution of 51. If you're a federalist, you would like to do the version of 1951. And if you don't like federalism, then you want to do 51 plus modifications of 63. And if you want to go beyond that and have a body of laws that actually defines local rule, divides the provinces and so on, then you would go 51 plus 63, and all the laws based on 63 up to 1969, 31st of August. Okay? I'm of that view myself. I think that the chances of us producing the constitutional draft very quickly are almost zero, simply because people are not listening to each other. Now, maybe a miracle will happen, and maybe once we reach the abyss and the cliff, what I would call a legitimacy cliff, and we see the nihility of not having something, maybe Libyans will be creative again, and something will happen, something will give. And the only thing I can predict about Libyans, and then one of them, is that we're unpredictable in many ways. So it could happen, but it's really a reckless risk to take to reach that cliff. I am of the view that either we renew the GNC legitimacy through another general election, or we go with the Constitution of 51, modified 63, with all the laws up to 69, August 31st, use it for maybe 4 years, and get the king to promise that he will do a referendum within that period. I've actually expressed this publicly, and it's gotten good response. I'm not so sure that it's not something that you can, let me put it this way, it's far-fetched, okay? And I've tested it out, and it's far-fetched. But maybe it will get us discussing some solution, even if it's not acceptable, but we need to think about it, because we are approaching such a cliff. Now, the difficulty in reaching a constitution is precisely the mechanisms for consensus, and I was mentioning that there is a problem of getting the dialogue started. And there's also a problem of spoilers of any possible dialogue. There are groups out there who are so committed to violence and who see the rest of the society as kuffar or infidels, who will not be part of any consensus making. By definition, they just will not accept it. And I think there is a need for a very, very quick social contract of the kind that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ made actually even pre-Islam in what's called Hilf al-Fudul. Hilf al-Fudul was a very simple alliance. All of us, okay, will not let anybody push anybody else around, okay? And we sign on it. I think we need some minimal covenant of non-violence and committing to the peaceful settlement of dispute and using argument and dialogue and discussion to reach consensus. People who are not willing to sign on that, I'm afraid, have to be dealt with rather harshly, because it is, just a few days ago, people were parading in Derna, declaring their own Islamic state, totally oblivious to the wishes or the desires of the rest of their Libyan fellows. Maybe that's what the Libyans want, but nobody should be able to unilaterally declare this. It's not right to actually preempt all the closure to all processes. So I think we need some sort of a covenant. But again, in order to have this covenant, we need to talk. And in order to talk, we have to feel that we are weak enough and ignorant enough and messed up enough that we need our fellow Libyans. But it's not so also sad. Libyans have demonstrated a huge capacity for resilience. And there have been some very interesting sources of resilience that I would like to mention. First of all, and a very important and I think foundational source for resilience, are Libyan women. I know this may sound strange, but it was the mothers of the people jailed in Buslim and slaughtered in Buslim who actually started this revolution. This was an uprising started by women, and not only started by women, but sustained by women, and won at least 50% by women, at least 50% of the Libyan effort, because NATO also contributed. Okay, so the Libyan women are a very important source for resilience that has to be invoked, and indeed they have shown tremendous bravery, not only during the revolution but also in the post-revolutionary period. And many men became courageous only because the women pushed them to be so. And I'll be ready to admit that my wife and my mother and my sisters and my daughter had a lot to do with whatever so-called bravery I demonstrated during the revolution. And my wife put it quite bluntly: you don't go to Benghazi, don't come home. So I had to go to Benghazi. So Libyan women are extremely important, and they, having contributed, I think, 50% or more to the revolution, they've ended up with not more than 10 or 15% in all cases, and token ministries. I believe that future governments should be 50% women, and the GNC should be 50% women. That may sound drastic, but I think that's the only fair thing. Now, another form of resilience is religious resilience, and we've seen all scholars of the traditional schools offer a lot of resistance to radicalization and to extremism. The League of Libyan Ulama, which was formed out of the network of free ulama, and also the Council of Sufis in Libya, have offered a lot of balancing fatwas, if I may say so. They don't even call them fatwas out of respect for the mufti, but they are fatwas of sorts. And they've countered every fatwa that they saw as not representing the authentic tradition of Libya, which was historically Ash'ari, Maliki, and Sufi, with the exception of the Nafusa mountains, where some Ibadi followers were historically living. So most recently, for example, there was a fatwa to bring down the government, and the League of Libyan Ulama made a declaration that it wasn't the Dar al-Ifta's business to do that. So this religious resilience is also important to invoke and to talk to. There is also tribal resilience. The great tribes of Al-Abidat and Al-Awagir have offered a lot of resilience and feisty resistance to attempts by small ideological groups to dominate their areas. And there is also youth resilience. The young people who are now pushing for the 9th of November movement, the young people who pushed for the Benghazi demonstrations against violence. Last night there were demonstrations in Benghazi, and I understand today, after the funeral of that family that I had mentioned, there were demonstrations. These young people are very brave. And not just because I'm now the chairman of the Ahli club in Benghazi, but really, truly, this is a very important case. I would like you to go to YouTube and check out the game. The young people of Benghazi, against all odds, managed to organize on their own a tournament, a pan-Arab tournament for Arab basketball clubs. They not only organized it, they manned all the stations, they secured all the games, they offered hospitality with their own vehicles and buses, and offered food and so on to the guests, and they successfully completed the tournament and actually won. So they're the Arab champions because of this. So it was my honor from Washington to announce that we're going to bring them to the United States for a tour. They're now the Arab champions, these young people from Benghazi. And they did this with hardly any help from anyone. Okay? Even their new chairman and the committee, two of whose members are with me. So these are just examples of the resilience that young people are offering. But the most important resilience that Libya has is what I would call the resilience of distribution. Okay? What is often lamented as fragmentation, I believe, is a blessing. Because just as the internet is remarkably resilient simply because it's so massively distributed and so massively interconnected. Libyan communities at the municipal level, village level, local council level offer great resilience if we are able to interconnect them. That is why I believe that if we help the municipalities through municipal reconstruction teams and Corps of Engineers kind of advice, plus maybe creating a smart grid that can help them communicate with each other, I believe that the municipalities, what Thomas Jefferson would call the little republics, okay, and the small town discussions will give the stability that Libya needs. Even weapons, when they're massively distributed, properly registered, and properly communicated about, I think can be a lot safer than programs that are tilted so that one ideological group ends up with all the weapons and everybody else gets disarmed, for example. So I think that massive parallelism and distribution can offer that kind of resilience. And most importantly, I think a very important form of resilience is vision of a future. Something that we haven't been doing enough about and haven't been expressing ourselves enough about. We need to have strategic communication that can actually give a vision that's positive. Many people were united because they were all against Gaddafi. But it's not enough to have liberty from something. It's important to have liberty to do things, to construct things. And it is very important to have visions and to share visions. What's my vision of Libya? It's very simple. It's that of a window. Yeah? The Taoists say, like Lao Tzu has in his book, the phrase that what's useful about the window is what's not there. Maybe Libya should not be so obsessed with the biggest cement factory in North Africa and the biggest steel factory in North Africa as Gaddafi was doing, but simply try to be a free zone of trade as it was historically. So that instead of being a free zone for drug smuggling or illegal immigration, it can be a free zone for free trade. And it can also be a window through sunshine comes. Libya is the best place for putting solar energy systems, and Europe needs that. We can sell electricity to Europe from our sun very cleanly. And Libya can be a window of fresh air through sustainable development that respects the environment. And finally, Libya can be a very smart window if we build a smart grid. And I'll make sure that I will not sell any equipment so that it's not conflict of interest, okay? Because I am the IBM dealer for Libya, by okay? So building a smart grid that can actually get the country to communicate. Because Libya, historically, was only united under imposition of an imperial will or a fascist will. In the new Libya, we can achieve unity, but from below, by netting together through a smart grid all the little republics that Jefferson spoke about, so that we can have a Jeffersonian democracy that is rooted in Islam's traditions, the Islam of Libya, the old Islam, the 1,000-year-old Islam, balanced between doctrine, jurisprudence, and spirituality that our forefathers have taught us, and that is in such danger today, so of becoming a kind of a minority under destruction. So that is, I believe, a vision that is achievable and that is shareable with others, so that maybe we can discuss together how to go forward. I'm sorry for taking so long, but there was so much ground to cover. And I would like to now open the floor for questions so we can have an open discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.